Assault-style rifle. That's a nonsense term used by an RCMP officer invited as a Crown witness to testify in the trial of Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenek today in Lethbridge, Alberta. It's a term that was objected to by Catherine Bayak, the defense attorney representing Chris Carbert, and also agreed with essentially by Justice David Lebrens, the judge overseeing this trial. Robert Kraychik reporting for Rebel News. Both Chris Carbert and Anthony Olenek are charged with conspiracy to murder. The Crown is alleging that these two men conspired to murder police officers during their time participating in the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade. They're also being charged with unlawful possession of a firearm for a purpose dangerous to the public peace. They're also both being charged with mischief over $5,000 for their participation in this blockade, which intermittently obstructed traffic across the U.S.-Canada border at the Coutts Sweetgrass Crossing, linking Alberta and Montana. Anthony Olenek is additionally charged with unlawful possession of an explosive device for a purpose dangerous to the public peace. Just like the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, Ontario that occurred at the same time, the 2022 Coutts protest and blockade was a civilly disobedient and peaceful demonstration against this massive apparatus of surveillance and control imposed by government and marketed as a public health measure to reduce transmission of COVID-19. RCMP Sergeant Gary McLaren was invited to testify today in the trial as a witness for the Crown. His relevance to the trial is that he participated in a search of a trailer owned by Chris Carbert that was at Coutts during the Coutts protest and blockade. And during his testimony, he stated that he had observed assault-style rifles in the trailer. The third time he used this nonsensical descriptor, Catherine Bayak, the lawyer representing Chris Carbert, objected to its use given its prejudicial impact, the fact that it's a loaded term. At this point, Justice David Lebrens, the judge overseeing this trial, dismissed the jurors and dismissed the witness. Now, what happened in this moment, I can't exactly report on because, again, all proceedings that occur in the absence of the jury are subject to a publication ban until the trial's conclusion. However, I can tell you what the judge told the jurors when they were brought back in. He issued them a directive. He said to them, quote, "Language can seep into your thinking if you're not careful." He explained that, quote, "A knife may or may not be used as a weapon and may or may not be deadly." He continued, quote, "Don't let the description deflect you from your job of determining what the firearms mean in this context." He was specifically referencing that assault-style descriptor that Gary McLaren used to describe the nature of these rifles that he had observed in this trailer owned by Chris Carbert. The judge concluded, quote, "The use of the descriptor assault really adds nothing to your consideration of the evidence in and of itself." The judge essentially agreed with Catherine Bayak's rejection of this nonsense qualifier, assault style, placed in front of rifle because it is, again, a loaded term that implies intent behind the inanimate object, the rifle itself. When the witness, Gary McLaren, this RCMP sergeant, was brought back into the courtroom to continue his testimony, he stopped using that term. The Crown also introduced both photographic and video evidence recorded from the trailer owned by Chris Carbert. In Catherine Bayak's cross-examination of RCMP Sergeant Gary McLaren, she asked about discrepancies between the photographs and the video of placement of particular items of interest, specifically firearms and ammunition. In other words, firearms were seen in certain places in the photos and seen in different places or not seen in the video. The Crown introduced photos and video captured during a search of this trailer owned by Chris Carbert. During cross-examination by Catherine Bayak of this RCMP sergeant witness, Gary McLaren, she asked this officer why items of interest, specifically rifles and ammunition, were seen in different locations between the photos and the video. In other words, there were discrepancies in the placement or visibility of items between these two forms of evidence. Firearms and ammunition seen in certain places, in certain spots in the photographs, were not visible in the same positions in review of the video. McLaren acknowledged this. When he was asked about these discrepancies, he explained that items can be placed in different positions during searches done by law enforcement. This would cast doubt on the original placement of these items in question in the minds of jurors. RCMP Sergeant Greg Tulloch continued his testimony today. He testified several days earlier but had to be interrupted for some other causes. We saw him also testify in the trial of the Coutts Three, Marco Van Hugenbos, George Jansen, and Alex Van Herk. Catherine Beak cross-examined him on a discrepancy between the way he described a particular chest pack worn by Chris Carbert, where in the Coutts 3 trial he had stated that this chest pack had been used for carriage of a radio. But in this trial he stated that it had been used for carriage of ammunition. So when asked about that discrepancy, couldn't really explain it. Also, there was video introduced as evidence in this trial depicting Chris Carbert having a brief communication with Greg Tulloch. When asked about this video, Greg Tulloch was somewhat ambivalent about acknowledging that it was in fact Chris Carbert depicted in that video speaking with him. And in that video, Chris Carbert actually had that chest pack on his person. And there was a moment where Chris Carbert, who we're seeing from the back in this video, turned around. We see the left side of his front as he turns towards the camera. And you can see there's no weapon there or ammunition being carried. There's also no radio. When Greg Tulloch was asked about that by Catherine Beak, he speculated, well, maybe the radio had been on the right side of his person. RCMP Sergeant Greg Tulloch continued his testimony today as a Crown witness. Many folks who I've spoken with, observers of these proceedings, mostly supporters of the defendants, have told me that they view this trial as centrally relevant to Canadians' rights to peacefully assemble, to demonstrate, to protest, to speak and organize freely. If you folks agree with that assessment that this trial is of deep importance to Canadians, then understand that we've got operational costs to continue this journalistic enterprise to cover it. The so-called mainstream and legacy media are essentially nowhere to be found. So we've got a job to do to tell the other side of the story. So please help us keep this program going. Visit truckertrial.com, contribute what you can, and stay up to date with our ongoing coverage.